Early bird, night owl.
Early bird.
Beach, mountains.
Beach by a hair.
Okay. Queen Esther, Vashti.
Vashti.
Bluey, Paw Patrol.
Oh, Paw Patrol.
Super Bowl, March Madness.
Super Bowl. With apologies to those who are trying to sneak out to see their
One big present, 8 small ones.
Yeah, I think one big present. Yeah.
Katy Perry, Pink.
Pink.
Call, text.
Call.
And the biggest question that faces the Jewish people, okay? All right, so think about this just for a second. Commentation, Lactus.
Oh, we're a Hamantashen family.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Passed.
I thought I was going to have to get in the car and drive back to Ithaca.
It's a long road up 81 North, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so we have questions, but I thought we would just take a moment. Rabbi Safman could explain how she got from molecular biology, right?
Yes.
To being a rabbi, because I think that's fascinating.
So I'm gonna truncate my answer a bit because already by the time I started graduate school, I had moved into the social sciences. I was dragged out of the bench by the fact that I hate routine. Lab science is all about doing the same thing the same way 97 times. By my third repetition of an experiment, I'm innovating a bit. My results look terrible. So I was a sociologist already, a social scientist by the time I started my PhD program. And I was drawn to sociology, to an applied field within sociology, because I was always very interested in how phenomenon in the real world impacted people, impacted families, impacted communities. And that's what I wrote about for my dissertation, for my master's and dissertation. They both focused on the AIDS epidemic in northern Thailand and the ways in which that disease impacted people's lives. Because my PhD was based on research in Southeast Asia, I got out of my PhD program, which I'd entered not intending to be an academic, and felt I had fallen in love with teaching, entered the academic job market, and found that American universities, American sociology departments were not so in love with the idea of one of their faculty doing research 12 time zones away. And so just as I was, about to buckle down and learn how to reframe my research to fit Indianapolis, Indiana, or whatever, the National University of Singapore appeared on the horizon at the American Sociological Association conference. And I spoke with them, and it was a match. Their first question to me was, do you work in northern Thailand or southern Thailand? I was like, where do I sign on the dotted line? And I was off to Singapore as an academic. I had looked into Jewish life in Singapore. Singapore has a historic Baghdadi community, which is rich and wonderful, rich in its depths. It also is somewhat affluent, but separate, culturally very rich and wonderful. But if you want Jewish life to happen in Singapore, you make it happen. There are just too few Jews for people to be on the backbench, so to speak. And so I became very interested in Jewish leadership. I was tapped as a Nahum Goldman Fellow and went to Poland, to Israel, and to Australia for intensive workshops on being a leader of a remote Jewish community. Got to study with people like Aviva Zornberg and Ismor Shorsh, Jonathan Sarna, just an amazing mind-opening experience for me, and began taking courses remotely. There were remote courses before Zoom, before COVID, through Hebrew College and through the JTS. And in the midst of all this, my congregation, the liberal community in Singapore, invited a rabbi out to lead high holidays, or I'm sorry, to lead the Pesach Seder. So it was this time of year. And he came out. I was the president of the community at the time, so I was hosting him and taking him around, and we were talking about my Jewish and other interests. And he said, how is it that, nice Jewish girl like you, you're taking all these intense, in-depth courses, you're leading a Jewish community, and it never occurred to you to become a rabbi? And I said, funny you should ask, no, but it's an interesting question. And I set aside then the following year to basically explore what it would mean to enter the rabbinate. As some of you may know, I know some of you actually have children who are Jewish clergy. It's a very intense application process. There are essays, there are prerequisites to complete. So I taught myself some of the prerequisites that I hadn't studied. There are exams, there are essays to write, there are interviews, and then there are more interviews. You have your body, your mind, and your soul examined, and there are visits. And at the end of this process, I realized that I really did want to put my academic career on the back burner and to make a life as a leader of the Jewish people. Oh, that's probably the problem. This is. No, that's better.
Okay, we can do that. We can share. We share nicely. Okay, so we're going to start with questions. Last time I started on the right side of the room, so this time I'll start on the left. And if you have a question, we'll start this side and work our way. Please ask, and then I'm going to repeat it so the Zoom people can hear, okay? Anybody have a question? Howard.
In view of the events in Israel, do you think American Jews, and I mean the individual Jew, the congregation, and the leader of the congregation, have a role and responsibility to, and what do you think that would be?
Okay, so the question is, in light of what's going on in Israel, do you think the individual, the congregation, and the rabbi have a role, I guess, in, what is it? What is the role? Okay.
So this is more than a hypothetical or theoretical concern for me. I lead a congregation right now in Ithaca. I, for many years, despite being married to an Israeli, took the view that Israel should be determining its course. It has, an electorate. It has an active and energetic media, and I should listen. And I could have opinions, but certainly not political opinions from the Bima. But what's transpiring in Israel at the moment is not just political. It's definitional. And Israel is the Jewish homeland. It is the only Jewish state in the world. And the state that was established, the modern nation state that was established in Israel, was established as a Jewish state and a democratic state. And in my understanding, and it's not just my naive understanding as a rabbi, it's the informed opinion of people far wiser and more deeply schooled in the workings of democracy, including Israeli democracy, than myself. The reforms that have been proposed in terms of the Israeli judiciary and some of the other measures being taken that have received less attention outside of Israel, but that are equally transformative in terms of some of Israel's priorities and the parameters under which they operate with respect to religion, with respect to the position of various marginalized groups within society. And frankly, liberal Jews are a marginalized group in Israeli society. Those are redefining the Jewish state in terms that not only I, but I think all of us as members of a liberal Jewish community will not be able to recognize, and that I would find a very hard time subscribing to. And what's more, because the nature of the proposed reforms undermine the very institutions of democracy, it ceases to be a completely reversible, or at least clearly reversible, course of action. That is, if these reforms were to go through, Israel could very well become like Orban's Hungary, or like Poland, or like Turkey under Erdogan. And that is a bridge too far. So on Purim, I wrote a message to my congregation. I'm happy to share it with your congregation as well. It's actually circulated widely, including, I was a little tickled to see one of my congregants shared it back to me. He had received it from his student, who's now a professor at Hebrew University. It was circulating at Hebrew University, and the Hebrew University professor circulated it back to his teacher because it said, oh, this was written by a rabbi in Ithaca, maybe you know who it is. And he was my congregant, so I have some nachas in that. But anyway, it's a statement saying that the reforms being proposed, and furthermore, what was actually the immediate incitement to me to write and to speak publicly was the actions in Hutara that were described by the Israeli chief of command in the occupied territories as a pogrom being instigated by Jews. I can't live with myself if I don't speak up in the face of that. So Israelis have every right to debate amongst themselves what they think the boundaries on the judiciary should be and what its relationship with the executive and legislative branches of government should be. That's an important discussion for Israelis to be having, but there are certain boundaries beyond which they cannot move and still be a voice for the Jewish people everywhere. And I believe that the current administration crossed that line, and God willing, with the bit of time that's been bought now, that discussion will move back into a space of more moderate rhetoric amongst all parties, and they'll arrive at a truth that's their truth. I believe that when Israel is acting in a way that is a betrayal of its role as the spokesperson for the Jewish people globally, that the Jewish people globally have a vested interest, even as we have the same vested interest when Israel comes under attack to speak when the missiles aren't falling on our roofs and on our children.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah.
In light of the activism type response you just gave, and also in light of your mention of social action in your sermon, piqued my interest as I'm the chair of the social action committee about Israel. So my question for you is, what would you do? What steps would you take? What actions would you do to galvanize the congregation?
Oh. Oh, I thought I had mentioned that.
Okay, so Mark Shenneman's question, being head of the Social
I mean, I
Action
really
Committee,
don't know these people.
Please mute yourself.
what would Rabbi Safman do to galvanize the congregation to get involved in social activism? Would that be correct?
I have a
Pretty much?
number
Okay.
of the person who's
So
taking
I'm going to just
reservations.
very gently correct you slightly,
I
Tony,
just-
because he said social action.
Because she
and
had to,
you repeated it as social activism, and I think that
I don't know
those,
if we have
no,
any
it's an important
openings.
distinction. It's
I mean, I
actually,
don't know
I
anything.
think,
I really don't know anything
important
about
for us
groups.
to make a distinction between the
Oh.
two. Because
no.
I think that there are certain
no.
contexts, including Jewish contexts,
Okay.
in which social action becomes a synonym for endorsement of a certain political position.
No,
And
no.
our synagogues,
Either-
to my mind,
I haven't
need
paid
to remain
anything to join
spaces
the
that
group. I
are
think there's-
comfortable and embracing homes for people who have
Right,
a
but-
wide range
but-
of political
I-
ideologies and affiliations.
A meal,
But
right.
Judaism
I think
is
this
at
guy
its
said this
core
said
a religion
numbers
that calls us
is
to go
410,
out into the world and to affect
486,
change. And that's what social
7433.
action is. Social action is asking ourselves, where
that's
is
what I
our
know.
world broken in ways that we have the capacity to
yes.
begin to repair? And let us pull together and pull together
he's just
our strengths,
he's
our
just taking the
resources,
reservation.
our human potential,
Okay, good. Okay,
motivated
bye.
by our values to fix those broken places. So some of the places where communities, congregations that I've served to this point have taken action as a community are, for example, in refugee resettlement. Just as a show of hands, how many of you who are joining us today in person, I unfortunately can't see the hands from those who are joining us by Zoom, but how many of you have a refugee experience in your past and your family's past? I certainly do, right? Is it the majority of us? Right, my family, neither my mother's parents nor my father's parents and grandparents chose in a completely volitional sense to leave Europe. They had to leave Europe, right? And so I identify, as do so many in the Jewish community, at a very visceral level with the experience of somebody who has had to find a new home for themselves and their family just to be safe, just to be able to continue their life with physical security and with security of their identity and values. And so it was a really easy, cause for me to go to my community in New London, Connecticut, and to ask my congregation to take the lead in a multi-congregational, multi-faith initiative to become hosts to refugees who at that point were pouring out of Syria and Iraq. We ended up hosting also a family from Sudan, but to say, these people have nowhere to go, and we can become a host community that gives them a chance to establish a new home. Another issue on which my community in Ithaca pulled together, and again was a lead community for a multi-faith effort, was in response to the needs of healthcare workers. I don't know if you'd see this as social action, but our first responders in the first months, first year plus of COVID were stretched to their limits and beyond. And there was very little that an outsider could do to actually help them on site or whatever. Everything was closed, right? We weren't even going to one another's houses. But we pulled together, we gathered donations from throughout the Ithaca community, from all the different churches, from people who weren't affiliated with any congregation. And we got them certificates to be able to purchase prepared food for themselves and their families, just saying, like, we see you and we know that you are doing everything humanly possible and then some, and we're going to take something concretely off your plate so that you can both feel appreciated and maybe just catch your breath for half a beat. So those are some examples of the types of things we do. They're not political in the sense of saying, this week the Republican Party's cause, celeb is this, and the Democratic Party's cause is this, but they're things that really change the world, and that we sign on to because of who we are as human beings. Thank you.
1 minute, I'm going to take one of the questions from the Zoom people. Okay. So from Zoom is, how have you, Rabbi Safman, contributed to enhancing synagogue membership and participation, especially increasing young members?
Thank you. So, a lot of the things that I spoke about in my drasha this morning, again, they weren't taken from thin air. They represent values, they represent goals that I've held for myself, and strategies that I've employed to be trying to better engage with individuals within the Jewish community who feel more distant from synagogues, or have historically. So to my mind, there are kind of three arms to this approach. The first is there are a range of activities that synagogues have habitually, historically done, but have sometimes done in ways that feel detached from people's current concerns and sensibilities. And it's such an easy fix to bring people's contemporary thoughts and concerns into our synagogue spaces through the drashot that I deliver, through the classes that we offer, through the ways that we observe different calendrical events. So just as an example, Tisha B'Av. Maybe your community is a community that people just weeks in advance are all abuzz about what Tisha B'Av is going to look like. In the two communities I've served, not so much. People are not staying up nights mourning the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago. But they are really concerned with divisions in our society today, and those divisions are real, right? We had people on the steps of our Capitol trying to lynch the Speaker of the House and the Vice President. So, and Israel was at a standstill a countable number of days ago because of the divisions in that society. So if we go back to the key theme of Tisha B'Av, or one of its key themes, which is Sinat Chinam, of a murderous hatred between fellows in a society that brings the society to its knees and renders it vulnerable, that's something we can talk about in terms of the here and now, and that's something we can talk about in terms of the reality that our community members, not just our congregants, but our community writ large, is wrestling with on a day-to-day basis. So the Shabbat programs that I've run for the past several years, actually not this year for complex logistical reasons, but for the 3 years preceding, all had a component rooted in a contemporary question or contemporary reality. We did a panel that was talking about the persistent barriers to complete inclusion of African Americans on the same terms as white or other Americans in American society. And we had a panel discussion on that, then preceded the recitation of, the chanting of Eicha and recitation of Kinot. The following year, because immigration was a very hot topic and the treatment of immigrants at the border was really under discussion, we brought in individuals, some of whom were documented, some of whom were not documented, but who were comparatively recent immigrants to our country. And they talked about what it meant to live in our society with an accent and with a name and with a manner of dress and so forth that identified them as being recently arrived. And we talked about that in human terms and about what the implications of these unfair prejudices in our society were. And again, that moved into Eicha. We didn't do it instead of the traditional, but we did it hand in hand. So the second arm, in addition to making our programs that exist or our activities that exist speak to contemporary sensibilities, is running programs that don't look like the types of things that you necessarily expect from your synagogue, but that are still part of being Jewish together. So my congregation in Ithaca won a national grant to run a series called Scientists in Synagogues. We tapped members of the community. There are a lot of academics in Ithaca. We tapped individuals who have expertise in a certain disciplinary area to speak about a topic we had agreed upon in advance, from their disciplinary perspective. And then I or somebody else with a deeper schooling in Jewish studies spoke to the same issue from a Jewish perspective. So some of the topics we talked about the ethics of organ transplantation. We talked about abortion. That was right after the leaked Dodd decision, but before the actual decision was released. So a very heavily attended program. We've talked about creation. We talked about kitniot because we're right before Pesach. I'll highlight that. We talked about kitniot. Has kitniot ever made sense to anybody in this room? I am not putting my hand out. But if you speak to an evolutionary agronomist, it turns out if you speak to an evolutionary agronomist, they can explain to you why some of the items that are added to the list of kitniot in different communities make sense given the way in which agriculture evolved in the ancient Near East and in other places in the world. And so I talked about kitniot as a Jewish kosher concept. They talked about it from an anthropological, agronomic, historic perspective, and so on. So that's another thing. The people who came to Scientists in Synagogues, I might never see at services, including at the high holidays, but they wanted to hear why kitniot made sense, or they wanted to hear what Judaism had to say about abortion. So that's a second class. We also did, just for those of you who may not be scientists, we did an artist in residence on Zoom series. It's still going on, where Ithaca has a lot of people involved in the arts, maybe a disproportionate artistic population. And we would have kind of open galleries where an artist from our community would talk about some aspect of their work over Zoom. They'd show some slides or they'd talk about their process. And we had artists, not only in our community, in art appreciation, people who appreciate art, but also in Dimona, Israel, which is our sister community, talking or asking questions of them and attending. So that was a nice way to pair the communities in a way that was completely apolitical, and that highlighted, again, people in our community who don't usually feel celebrated in shul for being who they are. They may get celebrated for Jewish aspects of who they are, but they don't get celebrated for the artists that they are, in most of their life. Then the third arm, so there are more examples I can give you, but the third arm of this outreach is just the interpersonal, right? We know that people come to places where they feel embraced and seen and appreciated, where they have friends, where they're greeted and recognized. Ron Wolfson, who is my teacher at Ziegler, is the prophet extraordinaire of this relational Judaism, and it really has legs. It has real depth to it, even if it sometimes gets sold with little taglines. I, as the most visible face of my congregation, need to be out there meeting people and talking about the wonderful opportunities that exist if they would take the step of coming to a program, not signing on the dotted line, not paying X million dollars in membership, just coming to something our community is doing, and maybe making those activities take place closer to them so it's easier for them to come. And when I'm at my kid's school for drop off or pickup, and somebody asks me, how's my day going? And I say, it's September, it's kind of a busy season for me, think accountant, well, I'm a rabbi, and this is where and they respond by saying, oh yeah, we're going to my mother-in-law's for Rosh Hashanah. That's a conversation starter, right? I didn't know you were Jewish. When you get back from your mother-in-law's, maybe you want to come, we're having a Sukkot event for kids. Our kids are the same age, they're in the same class, my son's going to be there, I'm going to be there. You're not going to be a strange face, you're not going to know nobody, etc. And every one of us can be an ambassador for the congregation, but I think going about it deliberately and really growing a culture of being those ambassadors, those outreach people. And furthermore, when people step in our doors, either literally or figuratively, step into a space we create, really making them feel appreciated, making sure that they're greeted and that they're seen and that people engage them in conversation, and that no matter what they're wearing or what their background is or whatever, they feel appreciated for being there because they've taken a risk.
Okay, thank you. A moment of housekeeping. Zoom people, there are several different messages to please everyone mute themselves. Okay, okay, I know David Madoff had a question. So David Madoff asked about incorporating more musical events and programming for the synagogue and wanted to know what the rabbi thought about that.
So I see no halachic barriers to the incorporation of music, including instrumental music, in Jewish religious life, Jewish ritual life. Obviously, Jewish life at large, there is no barrier. We could, on a Sunday afternoon have a concert, but I don't think that's what you're asking about. If it is, then that's easy, right? That's easy, right? I mean, that's an aspect of Jewish culture that we should be celebrating. My congregation in New London had an endowment for an annual Cantor's concert, and Purim was a big musical occasion and so forth. So that's easy. You have the talent, or you know where to find the talent. I'm all on board. And furthermore, my mom was a musician. I don't have her talent, but I got the appreciation. So that one's just an easy yes. But when we think also about our ritual spaces, I did a teaching in my congregation, a series of, I think it was 2 classes in my congregation in Ithaca, where there was more hesitation, more reluctance to involve music, either kind of a cappella, vocal music that was not the traditional liturgy or settings, or especially instrumental music in the ritual spaces. And I and my education director, who's also an RA member, an RA rabbi, and a member, as it happens, of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, talked about why there was space halachically in a conservative Jewish context to allow that. But space doesn't mean it's, the fact that there's the right or the opening doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. That's where you go back to the congregation, to the community itself, and say, what's your sensibility on this, and what are the tolerances? Music is not like just green light music, at all costs, no constraints, what you need to think about why you want to have music. What are you trying to achieve? And then you search out those musicians, you find the musicians who you can work with, be it the Chazan or other professional or amateur musicians in the community, and you articulate to them, this is what we're trying to do. Now work with me so we can figure out how to express that musically. And if the congregation says, music Friday night, but only up to Baruch Hu, then you work within that parameter. You don't have to shove down people's face that, all barriers aside or whatever. Music should be a tool through which we engage, and it only serves that way if it's respectful of the sensibilities and the interests of the congregation.
I have a very long question from Harry Bommel. I'm going to try to read it. He's a lawyer, right? Okay. This is his opening argument, I guess. I'm only teasing. Okay. Has the pandemic experience fundamentally changed what it means for faith-based communities to congregate? In context, 75 congregant screens were participating in this morning's service. Is this a good thing? And what is your vision for being a cohesive congregation in a post-pandemic world when congregants make choices how they participate in religious services and other congregational offerings? That's a long question.
So I'm going to take the first part of that question as kind of just a preamble. Has congregational life changed in the face of Zoom? You're asking me the question via Zoom, for sure. For sure. I'm not making fun of the questioner, but absolutely, our lives, our sensibilities have changed irrevocably, because of the experience of COVID. And I don't think all of us realized to what extent we were going down a path that we couldn't just easily walk back. I certainly didn't when our congregation started Zoom services. I assumed when conditions changed, we turn off the Zoom, people would come in, etc. That said, I did a presentation in 2015 at the USCJ conference about convention conference. We have an expert here. I can't remember what they call it. About the use of streaming technology on Shabbat. I was an early adopter of streaming. It was at that point unidirectional streaming. And I talked from a halachic perspective, but also from a technological and conceptual programmatic perspective about why I thought that was a good thing. And I still think it's a good thing. I still think that it is a machaya for our congregants or would-be congregants who can't get out of the house or can't get into the shul for a variety of reasons. It can be illness or infirmity. It can be circumstantial. They're traveling. They're, not able to get out. They have young children and they just, despite the quiet room, don't feel comfortable or can't contain the kids enough to bring them into a synagogue space, but they want to be part of a synagogue space, or they want to access a program that's happening at a time that they can't get to. So it is unquestionably a good thing for us to be able to reach those people where they are in both a physical and conceptual sense. However, it is definitely bleeding strength from our congregations and our feeling of being a congregation together to have as large a proportion of our population choosing to access us solely through remote technology. And so I think, as with most things, the carrot is more effective than the stick. We need to set up incentives for people to be with us in person. Right? You had the perfect example in the way you structured this weekend's programming, right? That was a great kiddish lunch for those who are joining by Zoom. Sorry to say this in your presence, but that was a great kiddish lunch. And I bet that the Danish and coffee, it's Danish and coffee tomorrow morning.
Yes.
I'm not eating the hotel breakfast. I'm holding out for the Danish and coffee. And I can't feed it to you via Zoom. And I can't feed you the Italian dinner that I hope we'll prepare together when we have a thematic Kabbalat Shabbat service where we use Italian settings for the liturgy and then step into the social hall for a meal together that follows on from that and that builds on the culinary traditions of the Jews of Italy. Last night's dinner was unspeakably, didn't mean to leave that off the list. But no, we're not going to beat people into submission by saying, you have to be here. We may convince some of those who are on the fence by simply shutting off the Zoom, but think of all the other people we're going to exclude for whom it's really not a choice at this point. It's Zoom or nothing. Do you really want to kick somebody in the teeth because they feel they're immune compromised? They know they're immune compromised and can't be in here, or because they're traveling and they still want to be able to be here for the, Goldschmidt child's bar mitzvah, then, let's welcome those people the way we would welcome anybody who wants to be amongst our numbers, but let's give them put as much of a thumb on the scale as we can to shift their preferences in favor of being here if that's an option for them.
It's great. Okay. It's funny, my maiden name was Goldschmidt. So when you said that, I was like, how did you know that? How did you know that? Okay. All right. Hopefully that's, hopefully I didn't miss anyone. I don't see any. Okay, somebody else. Okay, we'll get to that. Stacy, we're going to make our way to everybody. We are. Oh, I didn't get, I'm sorry. Okay, well, let's start, okay, go ahead, Barry, I'm sorry. Another Goldschmidt, so.
Mazal tov on your son or grandson's upcoming bar mitzvah.
First of all, I want to thank you for bringing the congregants from table to table. We met personally last night. This congregation has a brotherhood and a sisterhood. What's been your experience working with assisted brotherhoods and sisterhoods?
You know, this, were I to come to Beth Israel, this would be a unique opportunity for me to work in tandem with a vibrant and functioning brotherhood and sisterhood. I think that those organizations historically, across the conservative Jewish world, across the Jewish world, were real engines of programming and outreach and connection for our members. And frankly, in New London, in Congregation Bethel that I served there, the sisterhood existed only kind of in memoriam in the form of a flower fund. And in Ithaca, the sisterhood still exists to an extent. They run some excellent programming, tapping into not just Torah Fund, but I'm blanking out on the larger organization of which that's part, Women's League, the Women's League. But the Brotherhood exists only as a once a year latke dinner. And I would love to see, actually, if I'm going to be honest about it, giving my demographic, I'd especially like to see the brotherhood vibrant, because there are ways in which men talk to other men that I can't participate in, right? I don't have a Y chromosome. I don't have the experience. No, I don't have the same experiences as somebody who's walked through life as a man, in the same way that somebody who doesn't identify as a woman can't quite get some of the aspects of my reality. And that's wonderful that we have this variety and that we have peers in these realities that we can talk to. So I'm all ears. I'd like to understand better what sorts of things you'd like to do, and I'd like to make them happen. Most importantly, though, I'd like to have these activities happening and this thinking happening at a table together, at least to some extent, so that we can build on each other's ideas and contribute and bring them together so that they're in line with larger goals and visions that we have.
Like to say I signed up for sports night, okay? So, well, they have it and it's fun. So Stacy, we're gonna make our way up. Everybody, don't worry. Okay. You want to repeat it? I can't repeat that.
Thinking in terms of, let me phrase just slightly differently, the different constituencies who we do meet, or the different constituencies whom we might meet through our programming, through our outreach, through building relationships. How do we know how we're doing at reaching these different groups, especially the groups who maybe don't sign on the dotted line and become members? Is that a fair extrapolation from your question? And then based on that data, presumably, how do we do a better job in areas that we're missing, or if our efforts aren't working? So Let me start with a framework that was proposed to me, that was taught to me by one of my teachers in rabbinical school, one of my mentors, Ed Feinstein, who just stepped down, I believe, a year ago as the senior rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom in the LA area. It's a very large congregation, very important on the national stage, and he, rightly so, is regarded as a rabbi's rabbi and a master teacher. So what Rabbi Feinstein does in his congregation, what he did as senior rabbi, was to have in his office a chart that that went, month to month, and it said, who are the big groups that we're trying to reach? We've got young adults, we've got families with young children, we've got families with teenage children and the teenagers themselves. We've got empty nesters, we've got seniors, and we can add to that chart. His chart didn't have it, but given the way we're thinking today, we have people who come to the show once a year for a program. We have people who tune into our programs, on Zoom, but don't affiliate and don't come. We have people who read our newsletter or read the rabbi's messages, but don't actually show up for things. Whatever, we can figure out what those categories are. And then it had, as a cross-cutting, if those were the rows or whatever, it has as its columns different dimensions of congregational life and function. So ritual and education and social action, etc. And then they would go through, the team of rabbis would go through on a monthly or biweekly, I can't remember, basis, and they'd say, so what do we have to fill in for each of these blocks for this time period? What have we done for our, say, empty nesters that would make them feel that their ritual needs are being addressed? Or what have we done for our teenagers that their educational needs are being programmed for, and so on? And if there were empty spaces in that rubric, that was an area to target. It wasn't necessarily, depending on the resources of the congregation, depending on the time of year, et cetera, it wasn't that every blank was going to always be filled, but that awareness saw to it that the same squares weren't going to be left empty repeatedly. And I think that to the extent that you speak to as wide a range of constituencies as frequently or as regularly as possible, not frequently, but regularly as possible, across a variety of different potential needs, the more likely you are to connect with somebody and to start a dialogue. And then we need to be actually, to a certain extent, keeping some records, right? If somebody contacts the shul, they sign up because they want their kid to participate in our Sukkot program, decorating the sukkah or something, and not members, then we should, after a certain period of time, have somebody placing a call back to them and seeing, what was that experience like? And did you know we're also doing something for fill in the blank, right? So that we're tracking these relationships. There are relationship management software programs and other ways that the commercial sector has used, the business sector has used since forever to understand when they were getting it right and wrong. And there's nothing inherently commercial or secular about that. There's no reason a synagogue can't use similar techniques. I'm not an expert on them, but there are people out there who are, and if I don't know how to access it, then I need to be talking to the people who can get us as an organization set up so that we know who we're hitting, who we're missing, and maybe even at certain longer intervals, doing some surveys in the broader community to say, when you think of Beth Israel, what do you think of? When's the last time you had any contact with them? What was that like for you?
Thank you. Robin, I know, Harold, you've been waiting, and you'll be next. I'm sorry. Okay, the question is, do you have a connection to Baltimore? And instead of saying, why would you want to live in Baltimore? How about you say, what do you see as the great things about living in Baltimore?
I should have read the Cribs, the search committee prepared for my arrival a little gift bag, and it had in it a 3-page, like, these are all the things to love about Baltimore. So I looked at it quickly, but I don't memorize things quickly. So I'll just have to give you my authentic answer. In terms of ties to Baltimore, I don't know if you know, but I grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland. That is, a part of the state that's more oriented towards DC than towards Baltimore. But my family would come into Baltimore, easily between half a dozen or a dozen times a year, depending on, what was going on, our ages, and, how long my brother and I could be in the car together. I actually took a high school, pre-college class at the University of Maryland's Baltimore campus. And I spent a year then as a graduate student, an academic year, on the East Baltimore campus of Hopkins, because I was taking an intensive master's level coursework accreditation in epidemiology and international health. So I've lived in the Baltimore area. Admittedly for, a circumscribed period of time, and I was a student, so who knows, where students' heads are. But I have a bit of a feeling for the area, and what drives me to it now is frankly, you guys. Like, anywhere I go, I can find an aquarium if I need an aquarium in my life. It won't be as great as Inner Harbor. I grew up, that was my aquarium. I love the Baltimore Aquarium. But honestly, how many times in a week am I going to go to the aquarium? Like, you come for the community that you're being, hired to join. That's going to be the community where your family lives. That's going to be your chevra, your fellows when you're here. And I have a little bit of an in there too, because I don't know how many steps back, Assistant Rabbi Rachel Blatt was a classmate of mine in rabbinical school. And the whole reason that we're having this conversation now is because when I was at the last RA conference in November and mentioned to her kind of in a catch up with one another conversation that I anticipated being on the job market this round, she grabbed me by the elbow and brought me over to speak to Jay Goldstein and said, we're looking to hire, you need to learn about our community. She was like, talk about ambassadors for the community. She was a great ambassador. She loves you guys. Mark loves you guys. They have very fond memories of their time here. Not without like, oh, this and this could still grow or something realistic, grounded. It didn't sound like you paid her, but compelling. I missed the keynote at the conference in order to speak to Jay. That's how compelling the presentations were. So don't tell the RA that I missed their keynote, but. I'm supposed to tell you that I'm coming here for football, but I have to say, when I was here, this is news to me, because when I was living in East Baltimore, it was the Orioles that people came to, and when you're driving down, if I would go back to Ithaca, to visit friends in campus or meet with my advisors or something, and I was driving down the 83 coming in, there were the signs, right? The flashing signs, ball game today. What? Don't even think about going into these neighborhoods. And so I'm gonna have to reorient to get around football.
So just as an aside, a number of years ago, Rabbi Blatt planned some kind of activity for after Hebrew school on Sunday, and there was a Ravens game, and I think like 6 people showed up, and she had posted on Facebook what they don't teach you in rabbinical school. Don't plan anything the day of the Ravens. So since then, every year I send her the date of when the NFL schedule is gonna be released. Anyway.
I know it was a decades-long project to bring football to.
Exactly,
I
okay,
feel your pain and I appreciate it.
okay. Harold, go ahead. So the question is, what is your position on gay marriage, and would you perform a marriage between 2 same-sex people who are Jewish? Sorry.
Again, it's actually not a hypothetical for me. My chavruta, my study partner, kind of my external brain, we refer to each other as an external heart in rabbinical school, was one of the first openly gay men accepted to study for the conservative rabbinate, and Dror Schenken Gould, who's now at Anshe Emet in Chicago with Michael Siegel, is one of my closest friends in the world, but also one of my most important teachers. I mean, we engaged around all these Jewish texts, around Jewish tradition, around Jewish liturgy, etc., with an awareness, a sensitivity to how these get read by somebody who openly identifies as gay. And I, am not embarrassed to say there were areas where I like just missed things that were real red flags for him. And I learned through that, to better see the world through his eyes, or at least be sensitive. I'll never be him, and he'll never be me, but to better identify what that means. And I really believe that if anything, the conservative movement took too long in opening its doors and its embrace to people who were not heterosexual, in entering, admitting them to the rabbinate. They are fabulous rabbis, or at least, they're gay people who are going to be great rabbis. They're gay people who are going to be horrible rabbis, but it's not because they're gay. And it's true for any other gender orientation, right? And similarly for recognizing their unions, they are choosing a life partner who is going to complete them and is going to allow them to build the families that they aspire to, and to build a Jewish future in the same way that a heterosexual couple would be. And again, the question becomes, is it a Jew marrying a Jew? Because if not, the RA has very, defined guidelines on how I participate. But I'm a signature on Dror and his husband David's ketubah from the little window when California state law made it legal right before they made it illegal again for two men to marry each other. And then it became legal through the actions of the Supreme Court. But I would do it again in a heartbeat. And I've not had the opportunity actually to officiate at a gay wedding, but that has more to do with COVID and the demographics of the communities I serve.
Okay, thank you. Robin. Other Robin. Sorry.
But I want to say thank you for coming, and thank you for the experience that you gave me personally last night during Shabbat services. In that it was represent how you walked around and greeted each person during the dinner. But during the service, you took a moment and we read one of the additional prayers with the sign, and that just spoke. It was different. It moved me spiritually, and I was touched. You also led us in Anavakoa, which personally I didn't like the tune, but last night it helped me prepare for Eva, because I'm one who comes to Omer each night, and since COVID I've been participating in another service where we read and they recite Anavakoa each night and make that formation. My question for you is, would you just take a moment and critique, if you will, your behavior, however you want to describe it, your participation within the service, and what you've seen from the congregation and your experience and your time here in Baltimore. So the positives, the negatives, your role, what you've seen from the congregational perspective.
Okay, so I'm going to try to sum that up in around 12 words. I think what Robin is asking, Rabbi, is, having been here last night and today, what does she see as far as our services, our congregation, her impressions, what things she may have done differently, what things she responded to. Would that be fair? Right. Right. What would Rabbi do differently, and what she has learned in the last 2 days being here?
Thank you. So I would say that, part of the learning curve of being here for this weekend is that I, except on the high holidays, do not have the opportunity on a regular basis to lead services in concert with Chazan. It's a great privilege. I enjoyed it tremendously. Cantor Matus was like just a super Bima partner, but we're new to one another, and I'm new to the experience of being in a normal Shabbat service, with a Cantor doing the majority of the leading. So one of the things that I would have to grow into in assuming this pulpit, if that were the decision that we arrived at, is just getting that relationship and that balance and the give and take, and better understanding how that transforms my role as rabbi, right? Because when you're the kol bo, which is the position I've had more often than not, then the ways in which you engage with the community occur across all different parts, the way you interpret the liturgy, what you say at this moment, the way you pace things, and so forth. And some of that toolkit has been taken away from me in being in a more circumscribed role, which means that at times maybe I engage with the community less or less effectively. But in other ways, I've just been given like this great accelerator in that I can never, will never be able to achieve the vocal quality performance that Cantor Matus does, without even thinking, or so it seems. So I'm sure he thinks a lot about what I didn't mean it in that way, but so it's a new skill set to grow into, and I know also just like the geography of this Bima is different and frankly a little bit weird. I don't mean that like in a negative way. It's a beautiful space and stuff, but being there and then coming up here and having people here, and now let's just, amplify everything by the fact that we're in Zoom and we've got fixed mics. I'm used to an over-the-ear mic, so I can, move my head and body and stuff and still be amplified, but that's not the case with the mics here. So again, I'm sure that I'm not, not working the room as effectively. Those are the big things, and time. I mean, just working out, getting a feeling for how long a congregation spends on, say, the Amidah or whatever, some of the portions where you turn time over into the congregants' hands, but then you need to take it back in order to control the clock. I think last night we ran a little longer than we had intended.
I was perfect with Amida from my perspective, because I don't want my Amida to be interrupted. And we waited, and waited until nearly only a minute was still there. So thank you for that.
Okay, so somebody up here Jerry, you had a question.
I'll put a little context for this. One, I realize that there's a lot you're still learning about the congregation, and also, granted, you don't know all that, you probably need to answer this question totally accurately. You learn out a lot of ideas, and that's a good thing. Let's presume for just a second that you get a job, you get hired, you jump in here for several years. At the end of the first 2-3 years, what do you want? What would you prioritize and say, at the end of my 2-3 years here, I need to accomplish these things in order to say my first years were successful. If I don't do those things, I have sort of failed myself.
Okay, that's easy for me to repeat. So the question is, if Rabbi Safman would be our new senior rabbi and set some goals for the next few years, what after 2 or 3 years would she say, this has been successful, this is what I wanted to accomplish?
Lovely. So I think any rabbi walking into a new community, a new congregation, has to start first and foremost by learning the place. Not learning the place just in the sense of geography, learning the place in terms of who are the people, who is your kahal now, right? A congregation is first and foremost a community of individuals, and as best I'm able, obviously there are calendrical demands and so forth, but I'd like to use as much time as possible in my early months, just trying to have one-on-one or small group interactions with as many members of the community as possible, so I know who you are, and sitting in your spaces in the sense of understanding what does it feel like to be in this and that sort of service with this community? What does it feel like to be in a class and to be interacting around a text or around a set of ideas? What does it feel like to celebrate certain other types of rituals and such together? Because before you propose, big changes, you need to know where people are coming from. And you need to, in the course of learning that, to also be able to share with the congregation, with your partners in this enterprise, a sense of what your history or your experiences or sensibilities or reactions to things are, so that you're starting a conversation. And I would hope that by the end of the first year, that I've established those conversations both with most, many, if not most, but I would hope most members of the community individually, or in a rapport one-on-one or one-to group, and also with the Kila as a whole. The other thing that certainly, at least what the search committee expressed as a priority for this community, and I know you've gone through some kind of more formal decision making and various thinking and conversations about what your future is relative to the changing demographics and geography of the Baltimore Jewish community. And my understanding, it may be my misunderstanding, I own it if it's my misunderstanding, is that right now the commitment that Beth Israel has made is to keep its physical feet in place, to invest in this building and making it the home that you want it to be, and to think of itself as being rooted right here in Owings Mills. But that doesn't change the fact that the Jewish community isn't rooted in place, that it's mobile, that it's growing, it's becoming more dispersed. And so one of our priorities as a team, if this becomes the rabbinate that defines me going forward, is to figure out what we have in our toolkit to be accessing individuals for whom getting into this building or getting to this site is more of an obstacle to participation than an asset. How do we get our programming out there? How do we engage with those individuals? What does that programming look like? And I imagine that we'll try different things, some of which will succeed and some of which will fail, because that's the nature of change and of experimentation. But starting that process of experimentation. There may be other issues that are really, on your front burner that I'm not as aware of now. And again, that's part of the process of starting conversations at the outset. It's hearing from you what you treasure in what you have now and trying to preserve as much of that as possible, but also saying, this bit hasn't been working for me, or this bit is working now, but I foresee it being a problem. And how do we think about that? What are the options we can put on the table?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going back. I haven't forgotten you Zoom people. So if you could speak a little bit, Rabbi, on your decision to leave your current congregation.
Sure. So I am leaving my congregation in Ithaca with a great deal of pain attached to that decision. I came to Ithaca, which was my home when I was a graduate student, with great expectations that reestablishing myself as the community's rabbi was going to be a combination of a very joyous homecoming and also of opening doors into my new role as a rabbi and a new set of relationships with the Jewish community in particular. But a lot of those dreams were hatched in an era before COVID. I interviewed and was hired before COVID was on anybody's radar in North America. We were just starting to hear that maybe there was some sort of funny virus in China. And when I arrived, the congregation that I arrived to, which had the same long-term rabbi in place for 44 and a half years, or 44 years in a high holiday season, think of what that means in terms of human experience. 44 plus years, 45 years of high holiday services under one rabbi, one spiritual leader, who had established his way of doing things, his precedents and comfort zones and so forth. So he leaves. A few months later, COVID hits. The entire synagogue shuts down. The interim rabbi in Ithaca did not believe in the use of remote technology. We sit in obviously very different places on that. But they just discontinued services completely. They were doing a few classes, but they were kind of like everybody was set out into the desert on their own, in isolation, in their own little individual cells, commanded by COVID. And that was a huge trauma for the community, into which I stepped then when I assumed the pulpit on the 1st of July. With high holidays, 2 months off. This was a community that never Zoomed, and they had to mount we had to mount high holiday services in 2 months' time. So I hit the ground running. We very quickly did a series of presentations on the halachic and technological aspects of the use of remote technology. We started doing Zoom Shabbat services and got people as comfortable as we could get them with using Zoom on Shabbat, in anticipation of the fact they were going to be using Zoom for the high holidays, because we had nobody in our sanctuary that fall, aside from when the Torah was being read, and then it was 10 hand-selected people. I mean, you lived through it, right? Just extremes. And that whole first year, in fact, that whole first year and a half was just a succession of changes and of really very passionate debates about what was the right direction. Do we open now? Do we close now? Do we have food? Do we not have food? Do we use the Siddur that we've been using, or do we use the Siddur that we can access digitally so that people who are at home can follow, and so forth? And there were just a lot of very fraught decisions taken in quick succession that people associated with me and with the style of my rabbinate. No matter that in New London, a congregation that I had served for 7 years, on the heels of a rabbi who'd served them for 32 years and with no interim in between, that I had made changes at a measured pace and achieved buy-in. That wasn't Ithaca's experience of me. And furthermore, I was in some ways in people's, maybe not in their minds, but in their subconscious, kind of branded as like the evil stepmother who had like taken their rabbi away from them and then stepped in on his place. I don't think anybody consciously assumed that position, but the conversations we had took on that cast, right? I asked them after our first Purim together, what did you like and not like about our Purim over Zoom? Like, none of us liked it was over Zoom, but what did you like and not like about it? And they said, well, it was so different from Purim before. We really want our Purim from in the past. I said, okay, so tell me more. Like, we'd had these discussions going into Purim, but tell me more about what was missing, about what we didn't achieve in Purim this year. And they said, well, Rabbi, fill in the blank, my predecessor would read chapter 1, he'd put on funny voices, and then he would go in the back quickly between chapter 1 and chapter 2, because they're having the fashion show, and he would change his clothes, and he would come, and I said, but that's a shtick. That's not the essence of what Purim is. That's the way that he did Purim. But after 45 years, they couldn't frame the question, what's Purim that's not his Purim, right? And all of a sudden they had me, and I don't look like him, and I don't sound like him, and I don't do his shtick, and I couldn't, right? Even if I tried to, I couldn't be even a second best. I'd be maybe a third or fifth or 10th best imitation of who he was. And that wasn't serving me or serving him, or, to my mind, serving the congregation, but there was a portion, particularly of the leadership, that really pined for that. And it just felt like, after we'd gone through a few rounds of conversations of that sort, that the thing that the congregation needed, and that I needed to be able to grow into a rabbinate that was mine and not his, was to be in a different setting.
Thank you. Okay, Howard.
Following on what you just said, you are coming into, assuming you will be hired, you're coming into a somewhat similar situation, which you know your predecessor in this case, because you said you had conversations with Rabbi Goldstein. But do you have any concerns, even though we had this gap year, so to speak, do you have any concerns about following the traditions that he established here?
Okay, so Howard asked, coming here to Beth Israel, it's a similar situation that Rabbi Goldstein had been here for, 27 years. And would Rabbi have any concerns about being in perhaps a similar type of situation?
So thank you for the question. I would be foolish not to have concerns about stepping into a shul that's been under the same rabbinic leadership for 3 decades, right? That would be really naive. I've done it twice now, and I've had a great experience. My mentor in my first congregation, my predecessor, but he effectively became my mentor in my first congregation in New London. What could not have been more of a supportive, menschlich, teacher, friend, colleague in making that transition, and had done a phenomenal job of laying the groundwork for the congregation to have now a new set of experiences and for a new person to step in. And it was like a cakewalk stepping into that congregation. Whenever I had a question that I needed, another perspective or some history or something on, he was there. And when I didn't ask, he was suddenly invisible. I mean, lovely, like couldn't ask for more. It was a textbook example of how an emeritus rabbi is meant to hand over responsibility. And in Ithaca, I don't want to go into the dynamics, but that wasn't the case. I'll just say my predecessor did not plan on leaving the pulpit. His health required it. So they hadn't done a lot of preparations, even absent COVID. And obviously COVID was an obstacle to them doing anything then in the immediate antecedent to my arrival. But I've spoken with Rabbi Goldstein. I know that he wants more than anything for his successor to succeed. He wants this congregation to succeed. And I'm guessing that as in any relationship, there'll be give and take, and at some point in time, one or the other of us will step on the other's toes unintentionally, and hopefully we'll figure out, how to avoid that happening too often. And similarly, the congregation's going to have things that I do or represent or whatever that feel foreign to you, because I'm not Rabbi Goldstein, as you well know. And I'm not, I'm not Rabbi Marie, so I can't be those people, and I don't think you're bringing me in to be those people. So if we each go into the relationship with an open mind and an open heart, and with an attitude of the dul nechaf zechut, to always advance or attribute to the other party the most generous of assumptions about their motivations, that if I do something that I step on the congregation's toes or transgress some precedent or whatever, that you don't think I'm doing it maliciously or willfully, and that I similarly assume that when a person says something to me, a congregant says something or critiques me or something in a way that feels a bit sharp or injurious, that they're not coming from a mean place and they're trying to help me. That goes a long way in any relationship, and I'm confident that we can move forward together. There's a whole generation of rabbis of the baby boomer age who are stepping down from pulpits they've served for decades now, and we all are going through this dance together. And I think that the congregations and the colleagues who are dedicated to making it work, and to really seeing one another's success as their success, typically arrive at a happy place.
Okay, so this was supposed to be an hour and it's gone on longer, but that's great because we've had, I think, terrific questions and really gotten to know a lot. So I reserve the final question for me, okay? And I was going to ask a question that isn't that.
Please, not about olives.
Not about olives, not about football. What might be something you do for fun? Just so to know a little bit about you personally.
Oh, lovely. So one of my passions is long distance cycling. In Ithaca, we have a tradition of a 100-mile bicycle marathon around the lake. We got big lakes in that part of the world. And so in my previous incarnation in Ithaca, I would participate annually in the ride around the lake and in other bicycle marathons throughout New England. I haven't been on a bike in a while now, which it shocks me to say, so I'd like to get back on my bike and start cycling again. The Chesapeake Bay has got to be the most inviting body of water to do any sort of water-based activity. So even though I didn't know if I'd rather go to the Catoctons or to the bay or the shore, I would love to put a kayak in some body of water, hopefully with my 12-year-old son who loves kayaking. And I love to do Asian vegetarian cooking. So if you open up your kitchen, I will get a bunch of people who similarly enjoy cooking, and we can cook to our heart's content, and I'll learn from you and maybe even be able to show you a few things.
I want to thank everyone for staying, want to thank Rabbi Safman. I can only speak for myself, but I've learned a lot, and it's been really, I mean, I had breakfast yesterday, and we kind of hit it off right away. I tried to assure her that your 12-year-old being embarrassed by everything you do is just par for the course, and that's just how life works. So that's kind of what we started talking about. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Please, please, fill in your surveys, give us feedback, email one of us if you have anything else to say. Most of you know who's on the Rabbi Search Committee, and sorry?
If you look at your survey, it is actually stated there that if you have comments, since I know a lot of people.
Wait a second.
A lot of people were unhappy that there was no ability to make comments. So in the survey that you received Friday, and again you'll receive on Sunday, it will say if you have comments, please send them to, and it's the President's Beth Israel address. And the email is there, and it was the only way we could do that, because it wouldn't have been fair to put comments in the new one, because then you can only comment on Rabbi Safman. So please, if it won't be anonymous, and some people are concerned about that, but I'm sure this lovely congregation wouldn't think of writing anything in an email that they wouldn't want to say in public. So thank you. And have it in by 5 p.m. on Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Also, my apologies, Rabbi Ezra. I'm sorry, I looked at you and I could just come up with Murray. So I do know, in fact, who my colleague is, but in the moment, here's Rabbi Murray.